In 1938, Dr Louis Conde found himself at the centre of a scandal. 25 of his followers had charged him with operating a confidence game. He had promised them financial abundance, intellect, perfect health, and the life of their dreams. Yet none of it had manifested despite the thousands of dollars that they'd given him. Underneath his spiritually enlightened veneer stood a man accused of being a predator, an alcoholic, a liar. The allegations made headline news, and soon people across the United States were reading about the strange metaphysical teachings of a man that claimed that he couldn't die, a man that called himself Lahissa, the new teacher. Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today's look is a little bit relaxed, right? We're really moving out of the no hat era now. I tried to film this video about 6 times. It is extremely hot here again. And as I previously explained, British residential houses do not have air conditioning generally. So I'll be honest with you, I was about to give up. I pulled all of my hair up, did it up into this like straggly thing, whatever. And then I was like, do you know what? I'm just going to film the video like this. I'm literally in my pajamas right now. But let's be real, is there any better time for me to tell you a story? And a load of you always tell me that you fall asleep while I tell you these stories, so maybe it's a good thing that I'm in my pajamas. In the fall of 1927, Dr Louis Conde arrived in Chicago and set up shop at the Morrison Hotel. It was actually the tallest hotel in the entire world for over 30 years, and it was incredibly plush. If you were staying here, you were doing all right for yourself. You had a little bit of wonga. Apologies to all of the Americans watching, that's British slang for money. Conde was well dressed, if not slightly flamboyant. He wore suits with a perfectly cut collar. He had long curls that he often slicked back. He frequently walked with a cane, and if it was a particularly special occasion, then he'd don a top hat. It's very la-di-da. He called himself Lahissa, the new teacher, and he began to give lectures in the opulent Cameo Room, a ballroom inside the Morrison Hotel, complete with chandeliers and room for hundreds to gather. His subjects were mysterious. He focused on occultism and New Thought, and the people of Chicago showed up in droves to hear him speak on the mysteries of India and Tibet.
At the beginning of this century, no living European had set eyes on Lhasa, this holy city of Tibet. Tibet was a forbidden land.
Conde's belief system was somewhat of a hodgepodge, as is often the case, but he was firmly planted under the New Thought umbrella. Now, I've spoken about New Thought plenty of times on this channel before. I bet you're thinking, my God, here she goes again. Most recently, I spoke about it in my video on Brother Carson and the Solar Temple cult. But if you're new around these parts, and I know quite a few of you are, then let me give you the briefest explanation I can possibly give. The New Thought movement in general believes in thought healing. If you stay positive and keep your mind pure, then you can keep yourself free from sickness and poverty. But if you're a right miserable bastard, then you're doomed to a life of misery. In all seriousness, in the 1800s, the idea was that everyone is a spiritual being. The divine is within us, and that we can use our minds to transform our material conditions. In the early 20th century, New Thought became more about manifesting prosperity and personal wealth. Anyone can be successful if they just decide to rid their minds of negative thinking. Now, I know I don't need to tell you what the issues are with a belief system like that, but I'm gonna anyway. This is my channel, goddammit. I'm allowed to be opinionated. Positive thinking can't change the minimum wage or provide you with affordable healthcare. It can't magic away domestic or childhood abuse. And the New Thought belief system often descends into nasty victim-blaming rhetoric, with some people claiming that traumatic life events are somehow part of your contract on Earth and have manifested in your life due to you being in a negative mindset.
When people talk about what they don't want consistently, what typically happens?
They get that. That's what they get.
More of what they don't want.
Yeah, they get more of what they don't want. If we could just talk about what we want, our life would be incredible, amazing, spectacular. spectacular.
Conde claimed that his teachings were for everyone, regardless of colour, creed or social status. But he seemed to be surrounded mostly by affluent white women. He did tell his followers that material things would not bring them any happiness, and that true happiness came from within.
Happiness does not come from outside. It comes from the radiation within, and it's just as easy. It is easier to have happy thoughts as it is to have miserable thoughts.
He didn't like to mince his words, and he pretty much told him to just stop moaning.
The more you talk about your troubles and about your miseries, about your tragedies, the more you are making yourself conscious of them, and the more selfish you are.
Now, Conde had clearly never heard of the old adage, a problem shared is a problem halved. Interestingly, there is actually research that suggests that sharing problems with others leads to you feeling happier. But according to Conde, you're supposed to just shut up and think of other people instead of yourself. He was visited by many women that were experiencing marriage difficulties, and his advice often made him sound like a 1920s Tony Robbins.
Wives who come to tell me eternally the same thing. My husband does not love me anymore. He doesn't make me happy.
And you say, I don't know if he doesn't love me.
I look at them and say, well, what are you giving him?
I can promise you he's going, I don't know if she doesn't love me either.
Are you making him happy?
But now, you don't suck his
You expect everything from the other person, but you give nothing in return.
And if she just blow me every now and then, it would be a whole different experience.
He even had a woman come to him who was experiencing marital difficulties. Her husband was like never affectionate or loving. He was very kind of like closed off, standoffish. And Conde claimed that because her husband had put up with her petty ailments, aka her sickness that had landed her in a hospital bed, that meant that her husband really did love her, and to expect anything else was just extremely selfish. I mean, I get that some people are less outwardly affectionate than others, but if that's important to you and you're married, then surely you want to make allowances for that. But no, according to Conde, the mere fact that he'd stuck around is proof enough that he loves her. Conde taught that all people in society, rich or poor, were born with all manner of different issues, and every single person could eventually overcome their environment. But his disdain was most often directed towards people that were poor. He railed against employees for being lazy, self-pitying, and always blaming their employer. Those are his words, definitely not my words. He said that they eventually became radicals that constantly complained about being mistreated.
As long as you have that sense of self-pity, that sense of wrong, thinking you are being mistreated by your employer, you are remaining stationary and not developing.
Conde once gave a lecture to a union meeting in Chicago where he said,
"It is pitiful to me, and it amuses me, the irony of it. To hear you men saying that the capitalist is holding you down. The capitalist is not holding you down enough. He ought to take every drop of your blood if you are not willing to do anything for yourself. You want everything, but you are not willing to make the effort."
I honestly hope that they ran him off the stage for saying that. They should have run him out of the bloody city. And again, do I need to provide a comment as to why this way of thinking is incredibly harmful? It encourages people to accept their material conditions instead of coming together as a collective to change them. And history has shown that the only way things have ever really changed in terms of rights for workers is through collective action like withholding labour. But none of that seemed to exist in Dr. Conde's world. And this way of thinking is still prevalent among new thought peddlers today. It's the think and grow rich mentality. If you're getting treated unfairly at work, then you should just work harder and concentrate on being positive, and then one day you too could become a billionaire. At the beginning and end of most of his lectures, Conde would guide his audience in a meditation. He would tell them to be at peace with themselves and the universal mind. He told them to remember the law of compensation, that they will get back what they give, which is a very convenient teaching when you're directly asking these people for money. For all of his altruistic talk, attending these lectures wasn't free, and private sessions with Conde could set you back an awful lot of money. Essentially, he was asking asking for tithings, which, according to an article by Tara Isabella Burton, is central to the prosperity gospel.
This money, many prosperity gospel preachers promised, was an investment. By showing faith, parishioners could have 100-fold return on their investment, a reference to a verse in the Gospel of Mark about those who suffer for Christ receiving 100-fold what they have lost. It's a show of faith and a shrewd investment alike, a wager on the idea that God acts in the here and now to reward those with both faith and a sufficiently developed work ethic.
Conde had a pretty good sales pitch for these donations.
Lahissa offered peace, he offered health, he offered life to be lived at its fullest. But his eloquence did not stop at mere abstract benefactions. More specifically, he painted a glowing picture of a magnificent temple of wisdom that was to be the concrete, visible symbol of inward and spiritual grace.
He would describe this would-be temple at length, and some claimed that his description was similar to what was known at the time about Potala Palace in Tibet. Remember, he also called himself Lahissa, which may have been a reference to Lhasa, where Potala Palace is located.
The Potala, in all its inspiring glory, towers above the city of Lhasa, just as the Buddhist religion dominates the life of the people.
He claimed that he was born in the Himalayan mountains of Tibet, and he didn't know his own age. He supposedly arrived in the US sometime in 1875. When questioned about how old he was, he remarked that nobody would believe him if he told them. Now, this brings to mind the Mahatmas of Theosophy, the belief in spiritual adepts that guided the early Theosophical Society teachings. These are supposedly people that are highly evolved, and they surpass the lifespans of us mere mortals. Some of them are said to have supernatural powers, the ability to teleport themselves across the world, and they were said to be headquartered in Tibet.
Mahatmas were a group of people who have, through enormous self-discipline, mastered the essential nature of being human.
Consciousness slumbers in the material realms, becomes sentient in the plant and the animal kingdoms, becomes self-conscious in human beings as self-identity, self-awareness. In the Mahatmas, the extrapolation is it becomes supraconscious. That is, you become aware of your relationship to the source of your own existence, to consciousness per se. So the Mahatmas represent the evolutionary spearhead of humanity.
Some believe that these supposed masters were fictional and were the creation of Elena Blavatsky, loosely based on people that she had actually met. But many believe that they actually existed. Either way, Conde seemed to be directly inspired by this theosophical concept, and he worked it into his own religious teachings, and seemingly his backstory. It's probably important to note here that he also told his followers that he would never die, that he would simply be born again. Now, of course, this is basic reincarnation, but from everything I read, it seemed that his followers actually expected him to come back to life. He eventually hired himself a secretary, Barbara J. Goad, in September 1927, and she worked for almost nothing. Remember, he's teaching that you get what you give. So in her mind, she probably thought that a salary would meet her eventually, that Dr. Conde would see her worth and how much she strove to do a good job. He would send her out to interview potential clients. She would inquire about their health difficulties or issues in their relationships and careers. Then she'd report back to Conde and he'd decide whether or not to take on the case. He ended up renting a room at the North End Club, which was a women's organisation, and it seemed that that was where his offices were based. Soon after hiring Barbara, Conde hired another young woman to work as a stenographer. Ethel Decker was born in 1902 in Illinois, but her family soon moved to Missouri. She eventually became a teacher herself, giving courses in stenography and secretarial work, before eventually being hired by Conde to work in his office, which was described as
a most businesslike place with card index files and typewriters typewriters and evidence. There were several girls, Dr. Conde explains, who had been found guilty of delinquencies in juvenile court and to whom he gave employment when they were on parole.
Now, as far as I know, neither Barbara nor Ethel were juvenile delinquents, but it did appear that Conde was always surrounded by women who seemed to be in awe of him. Barbara herself said,
"I believed he was Jesus Christ. Christ was coming again, and how did I know but that it was Dr. Conde?"
For a few months, everything seemed to be ticking along nicely. The money was rolling in, and he was making waves among the high society women of Chicago. But little did Conde know that there was trouble lurking just around the corner.
I went down to Florida to see an old friend of mine.
In February 1928, Conde was suddenly struck down with what he claimed to be tuberculosis. To heal himself, he declared that he needed to head south for a warmer climate, and so he decided to pack his bags and head to Florida with his secretary, Ethel. Now, if that was me, I'd ask him why he got tuberculosis in the first place. He's supposed to be this hotshot guru from Tibet that can heal people through the power of positive thinking. Why does he need to be down in Florida? Surely that's just him being selfish and only thinking of his own needs, stuck in his negative little sick mindset. That's how this works, right? They departed Chicago on February 8th, and Barbara was left in charge while they were gone. Rumours started to swirl, and people began to talk. There were allegations that Conde had received a whopping $5,000 in the form of a donation from a woman whose only name given was Mrs. Smith. Now, $5,000 today is a lot of money, but back then it was a hell of a lot of money. I mean, we're talking serious cash. This money was supposed to go towards building this magnificent temple, and now Conde seemed to be gallivanting down south. Was the timing a coincidence? Or had Conde seen an opportunity to treat himself and grabbed it with both hands? While they were in Florida, Conde called for Ethel's sister Grace to join them, claiming that someone needed to keep Ethel company while they were there. Grace was only 17 years old and was reported as being a ranking high school senior before dropping out to join Conde and her sister. The three of them finally arrived back in Chicago on March 20th, and the Decker sisters began working in the office alongside Barbara. But things only got worse. According to Barbara, Conde still appeared to be sick. She claimed that he was even brought to the hotel on a stretcher at one point. I don't know about you, I would have just stayed in bed. If I couldn't get anywhere unless I was put on a stretcher, I'd just be like, I'm sorry, I'm not going. But I guess Conde's just dedicated to the job. At first, she assumed that he was still recovering, but she then discovered that he was actually steaming drunk. That's right, he had been guzzling the sauce, and apparently he was wandering around naked, and she even saw Ethel bathing him.
You couldn't believe he was Christ and see him act that way.
Conde was eventually taken to the North Shore Health Resort, and he claimed to have pneumonia, but some believed that he had actually had a breakdown of sorts, that he was a raging alcoholic and he could no longer hide it. Barbara was fuming. Here was a man that she believed to be God, and suddenly he was behaving abhorrently. Now, she wasn't the only one that had grown disgruntled with Conde, and she soon assembled a group of disaffected followers, and together they decided to pay a visit to the state's attorney's office. They charged that Conde was nothing but a fraud, a hypnotist, and a man that had conned them out of thousands of dollars. Bertha Kellerud, a telephone operator, had given him her entire life savings to cure her of an illness.
I gave him all the money I had, $1,500 in my savings. Why? He hypnotized me and I was absolutely under his power. I was powerless. I fought desperately. I was under his influence and I just had to give the money. I just gave it to him. I was irresistibly attracted to him.
Then there was Mickey Quenze, who paid Conde $165 to become smart.
I am as dumb as I ever was. He made a bum out of me, put me in rags, as you can see.
A man named Mr. Barter had paid Conde $200 to become a better businessman, but claimed that Conde was more interested in his wife than anything else. And then there was Virginia Shinebull, who had given him almost $100. When asked whether Conde had been untoward with her, she said,
"If he had talked sex to me, I would have pulled off his whiskers and showed his real face."
In total, there were 25 complaints, and the authorities began to investigate. Conde was eventually arraigned on the 1st of June, and here's where it gets bloody ridiculous. So he's in court that morning on 3 charges of operating a confidence game. He gets granted a continuance of 7 days so that he can get himself an attorney, and he gets released on a $5,000 bond. That same afternoon, he's back at the courthouse with Ethel Decker in tow, but this time he's in the marriage court and they get married. I can just imagine him being like, "Weren't you here this morning?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, don't worry about that. I was just accused of being a scammer this morning, but now I'm just here to get married. Confidence game in the morning, married in the afternoon." That was a bloody busy day that he had. These allegations seem to be like water off a duck's back for Conde. He gladly told the press that he was the most persecuted man in the world, saying,
"I have had experiences in my 53 years in America. Oh yes, I can tell you many things. I have been persecuted. They have stoned me. I have been sent out of some towns in boxcars."
At first, it sounded like the kind of exaggeration that Conde was prone to. It definitely fit his guru persona to be persecuted. But as it turned out, there was a lot more truth to his statement than anyone had imagined. In late 1925, Conde arrived in Laurel, Mississippi. He told the community there that he was a graduate of a medical school in Belgium, a native of New York, and that he came from a family of French exiles. He claimed to be an internationally known psychologist and a writer of note. And while some in Laurel believed him without question, others were skeptical. The director of the county department of the State Board of Health had reached out to the American Medical Association to try and verify some of what Conde was claiming, and lo and behold, they came back with absolutely nothing. Now, I can't be sure of what exactly happened in Laurel that caused Conde to leave, but leave he did. Towards the end of 1925, he had arrived in Montgomery, Alabama, but it wasn't until the beginning of 1926 that he was written about in the local news. He again claimed to be an internationally known psychologist, but this time he claimed that he had come from Los Angeles, and he soon set up shop at the Whitley Hotel. While he was in Alabama, he managed to worm his way into several different clubs and societies, often targeting women. He gave lectures to the Montgomery Club of Applied Psychology, the Chamber of Commerce, the Theosophical Society, and even the local prison. In fact, he claimed to have spoken in many large prisons across the United States and other countries, and he told the prisoners,
"Look upon the officers in charge of you as your friends. You will find them so. Society is your friend, if you want to be real men. In the unfortunate circumstances that brought you here, it was not that the public was against you. You were against the public."
He also took a profound interest in child psychology, and he took out a series of ads in the local newspapers telling parents that he could cure their children of any mental issues. He told expecting mothers that they needed to create a serene environment and were to think only positive thoughts during their pregnancy. In pain? Well, tough luck, you gotta suck it up and slap a smile on your face. Feel like puking? Just swallow it down, grit your teeth, and think about how good you've got it. He also claimed to be able to cure adults of their confidence issues and to help them get over their fears. He again talked of the mysteries of India and Tibet and his time among the sacred lamas.
By way of explaining what we're about to do, I am first going to tell you a little bit about the country called Tibet.
My life with these wonderful men was beautiful and serene, given entirely to developing the powers that were dormant within myself.
He spoke about telepathic communication, and the way it's written about in the newspapers makes it sound like he's claiming to have these psychic occult powers too. They reported that he had received training in psychology in Europe and Asia, and that most of his time was dedicated to treating what he called subnormal children. According to him, he was an international authority on such cases. Now, it's mighty convenient that his education was given overseas. It would have been incredibly difficult to actually verify any of his claims, but he could spin a very convincing yarn, and he spoke with confidence. There was an air of credibility to him, and he seemed to know what he was talking about. Now, to be clear, I can't say with 100% certainty that he wasn't some form of psychologist, and that he hadn't had some form of training somewhere, but I can tell you with 100% certainty that there was zero record of it. In fact, there is little record of Conde anywhere at all except for newspaper reports. In May, a physician in Montgomery wrote to the American Medical Association asking for clarification on who Conde was, describing him as
a much advertised, bewhiskered, cane-carrying individual who hails himself as a psychologist.
This would have been the second time that someone asked the association about Conde, and I'm assuming that they got in contact and said there was no trace of him. The last record of Conde being in Alabama was in spring 1926, and after that he seemed to leave the city. Whether he was driven out after being rumbled, I can't be sure, but he seemed to disappear, only to pop up in another city 7 months later. Conde arrived in Atlanta, Georgia in December 1926. He booked himself a suite at the Georgian Terrace Hotel, and he quickly got to work looking for a promoter.
Promoter wanted. Man of vision and unquestionable promoting ability and sound finances. A big thing for a big man. Job seeker need not apply.
Then he took out a second ad. This time he was looking for a woman.
Lady of influence to interview clubs and prominent people, organize lectures and classes.
Again, he targeted women's clubs, and he gave talks about child psychology. He told these women that he was from Jacksonville, Florida, which is interesting because he had told the people of Montgomery that he was from Los Angeles. At this point, we're just to assume that he comes from everywhere. He also claimed that he had given his first lecture on the power of the mind 40 years ago to a class of students at Harvard. Now, I don't know what happened to him in Atlanta, but again, he didn't stay there for very long. In February 1927, just a year before Conde was struck down with tuberculosis in Chicago, he travelled to Biloxi, Mississippi. His arrival was announced by the local newspaper, the Sun Herald. They wrote that he was staying at the Biloxi Hotel, and although he claimed to be 65 years old, he looked between 35 or 40. Now remember, Conde claimed not to know how old he was, but here we get an exact age. And I assume that they didn't just magic that out of nowhere. He must have told them that. When he was asked about his youthful appearance, he said that it was due to his mental attitude. He just decided that he was going to look young. Now imagine if that actually worked. I mean, it would single-handedly destroy the anti-aging industry overnight. So part of me kind of wishes it was true. Also, remember that he had just told the people of Atlanta that he had given a talk to Harvard 40 years ago. So that means that when he gave that talk, he was 15? Is that what he's telling me? That he was 15 years old and he was so powerful and smart that he was addressing classes at Harvard? I don't know about you, but I just don't buy it. But that's just me. Skeptic hat on, that's just me. Now, the story Conde gave in Biloxi was somewhat the same. Again, he claimed that he had lived in Tibet and had gone through a spiritual development there. He also made the bold claim that he had fought alongside the Russians at Port Arthur against the Japanese, and that he had contracted tuberculosis there and cured himself by concentration of the powers of the universal mind. Now, first of all, the poor guy keeps getting tuberculosis. He is absolutely riddled with it. Second of all, why couldn't he have done that in Chicago? Why did he have to go and seek a warmer climate and then eventually be hospitalised if he is actually capable of curing himself from tuberculosis? If he's done it before, Why can't he do it now? There are some massive holes in this guy's story. After making a splash in Biloxi, he then made the short journey to the nearby city of Gulfport, and he was there for several months. He stayed in the Hotel Markham, which, at the time, was brand new and quite luxurious. He managed to work his way into civic clubs. He ingratiated himself with quite well-to-do people, and again, despite his rhetoric that his teachings were open to all, he seemed to directly target upper society women and prominent people. These were the people that had money, but don't be mistaken, plenty of poor people fell for his grift too, and he left many destitute. Conde soon moved out of the Hotel Markham and into a home in the Broadmoor neighbourhood, and it was there that everything started to kick off. He had been treating a 17-year-old girl, and she had been staying at his house. Now, I don't know about you, but that raises massive red flags for me, especially when I think about how 1 year later in Chicago, he's calling for Ethel's 17-year-old sister to join them. In England, we've got a word for people like that.
I'm getting the word nonce.
While Conde was treating this young girl at his home, people were beginning to make complaints about him. They ended up going to the police and reporting him, claiming that he was teaching scandalous things and that the environment at his women-only talks was awful. They also claimed that he was charging up to $10 for a lesson with him, which in today's money is about $180. So on the 2nd of June, Sheriff Frank Duckworth visited the house that Conde was staying in. He discovered the young girl in his home and began to interrogate her. Then, apparently, Conde came bowling in and confronted the sheriff and apparently got violent with him. So the sheriff dragged him down to the office of the county attorney for a conference, and they all decided to get together and kick him out of Gulfport. They were like, "We don't want you in our town, mate. Get the hell out of it." Conde did as he was told, seemingly abandoning the followers who had given him all of this money and attention. As far as I know, he went straight to Chicago. So we're back in Chicago in 1928, and Conde is facing 3 charges of operating a confidence game. According to Cornell Law School, a confidence game is when a person defrauds a victim of their money, property, or information through tricks. The perpetrator is able to defraud the victim of their possessions through gaining the victim's trust. So essentially, he's being charged with being a complete and utter scam artist. And we know that this is not his first rodeo. He was literally just run out of Mississippi for pretty much the same thing. However, when Conde finally faced the charges in court on July 23rd, he came armed with a lawyer that was ready to put forward a firm defense. His name was Michael A. Romano, and he told the court,
"You do not know now that this man is not the new teacher, and that he has not great spiritual powers. Was Christ accepted 1900 years ago? If he came now, would he be recognized and accepted? As far as this man taking money for the temple, did not Christ say unto Peter, 'Upon this rock do I build my temple?' And it took many hundreds of years before those temples were built."
So basically, he was arguing that nobody could prove that Conde wasn't a spiritual adept, and because they couldn't prove that, all of the charges were moot. The judge seemed to agree with him.
"I cannot see how I can hold this man on the charge of a confidence game for accepting contributions for a temple to be built. Should I hold this man guilty, I would have to stop all preachers, priests, and all religious organizations from taking any contributions towards the building of any churches or additions to churches, as I know of many cases where contributions were taken for 10 and 20 years before the church was built. I would have to hold them also as operating confidence games. How do I know that this man has not any spiritual powers? In all churches, we have to accept many things without concrete proof, and I believe a good priest or preacher who has given his life and his soul to helping humanity does have some spiritual powers. I hold the defendant not guilty and dismiss the case."
He was scamming scamming people, promising them cures that never manifested and then blaming it on them when they didn't. I would argue that even now, more people need to be aware of things like coercive control and how easily people can be tricked into giving up their life savings, their time, and even their freedom to men like Louis Conde. It's a scam that still happens today with spiritual coaches. Only nowadays they seem to have long disclaimers on their websites that tell you that despite all of their promises, they're not actually promising you anything, and absolutely nothing is guaranteed by dishing out $777.77 for a course in how to be an ascended CEO. In court, a former follower, Bertha Callerud, admitted that she had given Conde $1,491 voluntarily. But I wondered just how voluntary that actually was. Conde was a hypnotist. He was a confidence man. He could easily scam people out of money. The judge just seemed to dismiss everybody outright, and I can't imagine how disheartening it must have been for those that had been totally rinsed of their life savings. But Conde and the Decker sisters were over the moon. Lahissa, the new teacher, they began writing to almost every newspaper across the country. Wanted everyone to know about it. They began writing to almost every newspaper across the country, attaching copies of the judge's decision and asking the papers to inform their audiences of the acquittal. Grace Decker wrote,
"Now public sentiment has changed, and the hundreds of Lahissa's followers who doubted are begging to be accepted back into his fold, where they may again seek peace and comfort for their souls. Lahissa says, 'Come, I hold no malice towards any. It only made me sad that you did not know what you were doing, for the agonizing but commemorable words are ever before me. Forgive them, for they know not what they do.'" With Lahissa, it is at all times now that counts. And no matter what these people have done or tried to do to him, when they come to him, he helps them in their need with no reference to the past, for he is at all times ready to help those that need help.
Conde and the Decker sisters decided to take a summer break in their hometown of Sikeston, Missouri, and they tried to get the people of the town excited about his arrival. They organised a lecture at the Malone Theatre on August 29th, charging $1 a ticket. But according to the Sikeston Herald, the whole event was a bit of a damp squib.
The lecture by Dr. Louis Conde, the self-styled Lahissa at the Malone Theatre last night, got the reception it deserved, only 30 or 40 being in attendance. The people of Sikeston simply refused to pay $1 to hear the so-called teacher and advisor, with a beard like a billy goat and a mane like a jackass.
I don't know if anyone else knows who Rob Wolchek is. He's an investigative reporter in Detroit that covers scammers and grifters, and he often puts them in what he calls the Hall of Shame.
Hey Ethan, looks like your plumbing career has gone down the tubes. You're in the Hall of Shame.
There's something about this newspaper report that's given serious Rob Wolchek vibes. He would absolutely write something like this. Apparently, people were so incensed at Conde having the audacity to speak in their town that they actually protested outside of the lecture hall. There were even rumours that they were planning on tarring and feathering Conde. And I can't ignore that some of that was probably born out of religious intolerance versus actually caring that Conde was a predatory scam artist. Ethel and Grace were bloody fuming at how Conde was being treated in Sikeston, and they wrote a scathing piece to the editors of the Standard. They claimed that the people of Sikeston were of slow mental activity and of many physical handicaps, and as such they should have been grateful that he decided to show up in the first place. She then said that Conde does not care to spend so much valuable time, vitality, efforts and money on people who are so unworthy, and that he feels nothing but pity and sorrow for the people of the town. The Standard responded by calling Conde a bad penny and hoped he'd leave town for good. Now, if that was me, I would have written back saying, "Sorry, Ethel, this isn't an airport. You do not need to announce your departure. By the fall, Conde had made his way back to Chicago, and he was ready to get back to business. But neither he nor the Decker sisters knew that they were about to meet their biggest foe.
I got your number. You can fool some people some part of the time.
After being cleared on charges of operating a confidence game, Conde must have felt somewhat unstoppable. He set up shop in the Sherburne Beach Hotel on 6249 Sheridan Road and drove around in a fancy car complete with a chauffeur. Yet again, he decided to target affluent women, but little did he know that this time it would be his downfall. The three of them began to send out literally thousands of letters. Conde would read the society pages and look through social registers to find prominent women to target. One of the recipients of these letters was Jane Logan, and she decided to heed his call. She visited with Conde and quickly became both his employee and his pupil. But what he didn't know was that she was actually undercover on behalf of the Chicago newspaper, and she was about to expose him for the entire world to see. Jane, Ethel, and Grace would work together in Conde's offices to send out these letters to rich and prominent women. Conde claimed that he could help them with anything from financial advice to a bad back or anxiety. They would even enclose a picture of him with the letter. If I opened that up and there was a picture of him in there, it'd be like a bloody jump scare. I'd be like, oh, ah! At first it seemed to be business as usual, but things quickly became disturbing when Conde demanded that Ethel, Grace, and Jane take a car ride with him to an undisclosed location. According to Jane, Conde made numerous suggestive comments. Then he placed his hand on her leg, as well as Ethel's. Now, surely that should have caused an issue. Ethel was his wife, after all. But apparently this was normal behaviour. Jane said that Conde reeled off jokes from the underworld. I'm assuming that means that he was being sleazy and gross. And she said that both Ethel and Grace were laughing nervously. When Grace didn't laugh at a joke, she was actually reprimanded by both Conde and her sister. It got even worse when Conde forcibly kissed Jane and said,
"We take lots of women riding and I help them just like I'm helping you. I show them what life is. I teach them what it means to enjoy life. I play with them, but it's all in fun, and it's all with purpose, little girl. I'm trying to get you over your prudishness. You must get over it. You were an old maid now, too sensitive, too proper. Mrs. Conde used to be that way. Look at her now, a beautiful woman and a real companion."
So just to be clear, to get Jane over her prudishness, she's to sit and laugh at crude and uncomfortable jokes, let Conde touch her as much as he wanted, and also let him kiss her. Yeah, I don't know about you, but I feel pretty confident in calling this guy a complete and utter coercive creep. Just an absolute scumbag of the lowest order. His predatory nature became even more apparent when Jane discovered that Ethel had to dye her hair a certain colour to please him, and that both her and her sister would be scolded if they didn't laugh at his jokes or seemingly appease every whim. Conde also said that if his wife had dared to complain about him trying to kiss Jane, he would have thrown her out of the car. It somehow got even worse the next day. Conde told Jane that she should stick around until bedtime because that's when she'd really see some fun. He also told her that she reminded him, prepare yourself for this bit because this bit is just awful. All of it's awful, but this bit is particularly awful. That she reminded him of a 16-year-old girl that had worked for him in Jacksonville, Florida, and he said that he had cured her of her prudishness.
Nonsense.
It's an incredibly disturbing revelation because at this point, I think we all know what he was referring to. Ethel told Jane that Conde liked to drink and that when he was drunk, he was at his most wonderful, taking on different forms of reincarnations and astral traveling while he was pissed up. It honestly reminds me of Amy Carlson in Love Has Won. She would be passed out in a drunken stupor and her followers would declare that she was actually doing etheric surgeries on a spaceship in 5D with Robin Williams and Patrick Swayze. And no, I am not making that up. Ethel seemed to feel so comfortable with Jane that she decided to share a secret.
Grace and I took care of him for 2 months when he was drunk once. That's the way he throws off unpleasant conditions. He used to say things that were, beautiful.
So presumably, when he claimed to be riddled with tuberculosis, he was actually riddled with vodka. Isn't it funny how so many of these proponents of thought healing are actually just drunken, disgusting sex pests who want free reign to do whatever the hell they want? It's almost as if some of the most unsavory characters are drawn to a belief system that is inherently individualistic and victim blaming. I wonder why that is. The horror didn't stop at a single car ride, and soon Jane found herself being invited to a Sunday picnic with Conde and the sisters. Apparently this was vital relaxation time after a busy week of helping people. Helping people? What? This man's never done anything in his life to help a single person. He's arguably made people's lives a lot worse. But as it turned out, their definition of relaxation was a far cry from Jane's. It essentially involved letting Conde do whatever he wanted, be it hugging and kissing or anything else. This was all supposed to cure Jane's mind and stop her from being so repressed, as Conde puts it. Jane was adamant that she wanted nothing to do with him, but he forced himself on her, and it resulted in a struggle in the back of the car. He told her to show up at the office at a certain time so that she could bathe him, and he seemed baffled that she had no interest in doing it. Now remember, a year earlier, Barbara Goad had charged that Conde was a drunk, that the sisters would bathe him, and that his lectures and talks were untoward. That also wasn't the first time. Remember, he got run out of numerous towns in the south, presumably for doing the same thing. And here was Jane Logan proving that everything that Barbara and the other followers of Conde had claimed was true. Had he been operating an abusive sex cult this entire time? Cast your mind back to the 17-year-old girl that was found in his house, his own admittal that he had cured a 16-year-old girl of her prudishness, the fact that he had Ethel's young sister join him, and his consistent targeting of women and girls across the country. When you put it all together, it paints a sinister picture of a predator who roamed from city to city looking for children and women to take advantage of. In September 1929, Jane Logan published the first in a series of stunning exposés on the man that called himself Lahissa in the Chicago Daily Times. Not only did she infiltrate what she called a free love cult, but she also travelled to Sikeston to meet with Ethel and Grace's parents. She said that they were a family divided. Their father refused to believe that Conde was Christ reincarnate, but their mother said,
"If he is Christ, think what an opportunity the girls will have. They'll be his angels and fly with him in airplanes."
The way their mother spoke, it kind of sounded like she'd been taken in by Conde too. She spoke about his many prophecies for the future and how people in Sikeston that spoke ill of Conde had now fallen ill themselves. Her daughters had been sending her Conde's lectures, and apparently they had been helping her. But Homer, their father, saw things differently.
Grace is a goner. She'll never come back home. If he takes them away, he said he was going to take them to India. I'll never see them again. I told Lahissa he would break up his family if I took Grace away, and he's about done it. My wife's under his influence too, as you can see. Ethel ain't herself no more. You know, he wouldn't let me talk to them when they was here. He'd always manage to be around. And the girls seemed to fight shy of me. He's always preaching unselfishness. He's the most selfish man I ever met. And if he's Christ, I don't think he could get drunk the way he does. And the healing stuff, he's never healed anyone.
It was a heartbreaking glimpse into a family that had been torn apart. They'd lost their 2 daughters, and there was seemingly no way of getting through to them. Unsurprisingly, the sisters didn't respond positively to Jane Logan's exposés. In fact, they left Chicago with Conde soon after the first article was published. They left a note for their maid, Hilda, telling her that she could have anything she wanted that they had left behind. The owner of the property they were staying at said,
"It is a relief to know that Conde is gone. Sometime before the Daily Times began to print its articles, other tenants in the building complained about Conde. He paid his rent regularly, and I could find nothing definite enough about him to put him out. We all feel grateful to the Daily Times for what it has done."
The articles were eventually read by the Decker family, and their mother soon changed her tune. She said that Jane Logan's work had opened her eyes. She was now terrified for the well-being of her children, and she wrote an open letter to the Chicago Daily Times.
Dear Grace and Ethel, we beg you to come home and assure you of our love and protection. We are praying for you to see the truth and come home.
All 3 of them seemed to have disappeared. Nobody knew where they were or what they were doing. That was until the man that claimed he couldn't die went and fucking died.
He's dead, he's dead, he's dead, he's dead. He's dead, he's dead.
On the 11th of November 1931, the Los Angeles Evening Citizen News reported that after years of illness, Dr. Louis Conde, philosopher and teacher of humanity, had died. The report stated that he had conducted classes at the Hollywood Plaza Hotel a year ago, so it's probably fair to assume that after fleeing Chicago, he headed straight for California. It also claimed that for the past year, he and Ethel had resided in Ajo, Arizona, hoping that the warm climate would help him. What they were up to in both California and Arizona, I can't be sure of, but they seem to have kept a relatively low profile. The Sikeston Daily Standard sent their reporter Kate Sussman to Arizona, and she set to work interviewing locals. They claimed that Ethel had worked as a stenographer in an office in Phoenix by day, and then she would return home to care for Conde. He also had nurses that Ethel paid for, but apparently he would yell at them.
"Don't you know who I am? I am the master."
None of the nurses stuck around for longer than a week, and can you blame them? Talk about terrible working conditions. I mean, you've heard some of the things this guy had to say about workers. Would you want to work for him? After his death, Ethel sent word to Grace, who had seemingly stayed in Los Angeles. Kate reported that she had made the journey to Arizona to say goodbye to the man who played the trump card in influencing her life. Dr. Louis Conde, or Lahissa as he preferred to be known, was buried in Ajo, and although the man that claimed he could never die was actually dead, Ethel was determined to keep his spirit alive. She quickly hired Frank Randall, who in turn hired a man named Charles D. Dunn to fashion together a monument for his grave. Work on the monument began in 1933, and it took a good while to create the cross out of peacock copper rock. They used copper wire to create an inscription, but apparently Ethel kept showing up to add more words to it. When it was finally finished, it read,
"For all races, people, beliefs, he came and they knew him not. Actuated by the spirit that has guided all teachers, he came to lead human beings into a new era, the era of man's full consciousness of the power within him. Man's power is unlimited, and he can reach out and get what he wants from that unusual mind. He came to overcome the so-called laws of nature. He will go around the earth in a flash of a moment and to the planets. Each one is a spoke in a wheel leading to the center. Give the best in you, this way you will find happiness." Indeed, Lahissa showed the way. He lived all phases and mastered all conditions, was persecuted and prosecuted. The foundation has been laid. It is left to others to bring into being the brotherhood of man.
Can you imagine having to engrave all of that into stone with wire? Christ almighty, there's not enough money in the world that you could pay me to do that. Laborious. In 1954, Ethel and Grace published a collection of Conde's talks entitled Life as You Give It, and they advertised the book in contactee Daniel Fry's Understanding Inc. newsletter, which isn't a surprise. That, to me, seems like the perfect place to advertise this nonsense. At some point, Ethel remarried to a man named Melvin Ernest Gibbs, and it also seemed that Grace married too, taking on the last name Barton. Ethel died in 1995, and there is no record of Grace's death as far as I could tell. This is where the story of Louis Conde, or Lahissa, is supposed to end. But if you've been on this channel before, then you won't be surprised that it kept bugging me that I couldn't find anything about Conde's earlier years. That was until I stumbled upon a few newspaper reports that told a very familiar story.
It's a mystery. Oh, it's a mystery.
So before we get into what I think could possibly be reports of Louis Conde 20 years before he was calling himself Lahissa, I want to be entirely honest and tell you that this is the speculative part of the video. I cannot prove that the person I'm about to introduce you to was actually Louis Conde, and I may be wrong, but I wanted to include it anyway. If it is him, then we've got evidence that he was operating a confidence game in the early 1900s. And if it isn't him, then at least you got to hear of one more interesting story. So it's summer 1908, and a well-educated and distinguished Frenchman decided to visit the small town of Livingston, Montana. He had an incredibly interesting and somewhat hard to believe backstory, claiming that his name was Monsieur A.V., a pseudonym that he said he used to write stories about his life as an international secret detective for the newspapers. Now, Monsieur A.V. was a name actually used by the writer Alan Upward, and in 1905 he released a book titled The International Spy. It seemed that this man in Montana was claiming to be this real-life spy, but as far as I'm aware, that spy never existed. He was a fictional creation. If you want my guess, I think that he probably was looking at the newspapers, saw the name, and then stole it. He was described as a very smartly dressed man. The papers wrote that he wore a fine silk handkerchief in the most approved style, and he was staying at the local hotel. According to those same newspapers, he was there with a woman that he said was his wife, and they apparently stayed in bed until around 12 p.m. every day drinking absinthe frappes. I don't drink alcohol, and even when I did, I was not a fan of absinthe in the slightest, but I'll be real with you, this absinthe drink does actually look quite tasty. He quickly made friends with an army man named Private Smith, claiming that he was about to enter the service of Uncle Sam as a pharmacist. Now, Smith took such a liking to him that he actually allowed the man to stay in his home for a number of days, but it didn't take long for him to start getting suspicious. I'm not entirely sure what happened, but Private Smith allegedly knocked him down several times, which I assume is the 1908 version of beat the shit out of him. And Smith supposedly charged him with obtaining food and lodgings under false pretenses, accusing him of being a fake French writer. Toward the end of June 1908, the same man arrived in the town of Dillon, around 140 miles away. He registered at the Metland Hotel under the name Dr Louis Conde and was described as a very smooth individual, stylishly dressed and very self-important. Now, who does this sound like? To be clear, the name is a tiny bit different. He's claiming his name is Louis Conde, but it really does sound like him. He also made the bold claim that the city of Dillon had the distinction of being visited by a physician and surgeon of almost international fame and great distinction. This time, he seemed to be less concerned about telling people he was an international super spy and more concerned with finding sick people and promising them cures. He even spoke about doing surgeries, but thankfully never delivered on them. He told the locals that he had worked for a number of years in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., and that he was employed on a salary of $9,000 a year. Now, it just so happened that the local physicians knew that the Smithsonian Institute's salaries were nowhere near that amount. So they were like, hang on a bloody minute, who is this guy really? They had even more questions when he started to give out prescriptions under the name Dr. Chappell of Billings, Montana. So they went searching, they found the telephone number of Dr. Chappell of Billings, Montana. They decided to give him a ring. And it's a good thing they did, because boy oh boy did he have a story. Dr. Chappell told them that the same man had been in Billings under the name Dr. Maylett, and he had stolen around $300 worth of instrument and books belonging to another man named Dr. Johnson, who, while he was on the phone, swore to a warrant for Conde's arrest. So the cops and Dylan are like, all right, we've got this guy, we need to go arrest him, we've got this arrest warrant. So they go and try and confront this Dr. de Conde guy, but he actually had fled town a few hours earlier on a train for the city of Butte, obviously thinking that he could make some sort of quick getaway. The only problem was that the people in Butte knew him too. He had actually been in jail there for 90 days under the charge of vagrancy. He'd apparently made a dramatic entrance there. The newspapers wrote that he had been wandering about the west side in the middle of the night, apparently dazed with a badly lacerated head. He told a story of having been held up, but the police claimed to know that he was beaten for speaking disrespectfully to a woman. He claims to be a physician, and there are a number of prescriptions in his writing for simple remedies, bearing various signatures. When he was released from jail after the 90-day vagrancy charge, he befriended Dr. Herbert Maylett, telling him that he was a graduate from a French medical school. Now, Maylett took pity on him, and that was like the worst thing he could have done, because Conde ended up stealing business cards from him and eventually adopted his identity to use in different towns. So eventually he gets arrested at the train station, and while he's waiting to be taken back to Billings by the chief of police, he was supposedly tried by what the local media claimed was a kangaroo court.
I'm calling kangaroo court on this court.
Apparently, while he was in that town the first time round, he had stolen a man's gun and also money from a local doctor. So they had all convened and basically took all of his money off him. Now, it may have been a kangaroo court.
It's a kangaroo court.
But I will say I've got very little sympathy for the man. He arrived back in Billings on the 1st of July, and the chief of police there began to receive letters from people in the town that had fallen victim to him.
Dear sir, I understand that you have arrested and in jail at your place have a man with many aliases, but who when here called himself Dr. de Conde, who is a thief and a scoundrel of the lowest degree. I am a poor woman who has not walked a step for 4 years, suffering and terribly crippled with rheumatism. He hunted me out, came to my home several times, said he could cure me, and said he would have to send to Chicago for medicine, which would cost $24. Thinking him all right, I let him do so, and he took my money and left town. Of course, I don't expect to get my money back, but I want you to know what he has done here as well as elsewhere and sentence him accordingly. Respectfully yours, Mrs. W.M. Ambrose.
Nobody could figure out what his real name was. Some said it was Dr. Louis Conde, and others claimed that it was Otto Brammer. Either way, he was eventually sentenced to 90 days in jail for practicing medicine without a license. In court, he argued that his diploma and license had been destroyed in an earthquake and fire in San Francisco, but nobody believed him. He was described as a drunken sailor, and there was talk of him having to face trial on the charge of larceny for stealing from Dr. Johnson of Billings. But after July 1908, I couldn't find any trace of him. There's no report of him being released from jail. There's nothing. It's like he just up and disappeared. Now let's take a look at the similarities between this man and the Louis Conde that we know. They both use the name Louis Conde. Yes, this man went by Louis D. Conde, but it's still pretty much the same. They both claimed to be doctors, but neither of them had any record of actually being doctors. There's also a French connection too. In 1925, Conde claimed to have come from a family of French exiles, and in 1908, he's described as a Frenchman. They're both described as complete and utter drunks. They're also both described as well-dressed and somewhat dandy-like. They both claimed at one point to be from California. They both claimed at some point to have been involved in the war between Russia and Japan. And finally, they both moved from town to town, scamming people that were desperate to be cured of both their physical and mental ailments. Again, I can't be 100% certain that this was the same Louis Conde, but on a vibes-based analysis, I don't know, I feel pretty confident that it could be the same guy. And if it was, then he was roaming across the United States, preying on desperate people looking for hope, and specifically targeting women for over 20 years. And I dread to think just how many of them fell victim to his dangerous game. Thank you for watching the video. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I also want to know your opinions on the more speculative part. Sometimes I feel a little bit uncomfortable being speculative, but I think it's okay if you present the information and are very clear that it's speculation. I don't know, when I came across those newspaper articles, all of the puzzle pieces kind of seem to slot together for me. Anyway, let me know what you thought of the video in the comments. I'm always interested in hearing what you guys have to say. And as usual, a massive thank you to all of my patrons that support the creation of these videos. If you want to become a patron, it's very easy. You can find the link in the description, also in the pinned comment. We've got a Discord server. There are some Patreon only exclusive videos. There are longer versions of interviews that I've done for certain videos, and you also get early access to these videos as well, and you get my eternal love and appreciation for just supporting my work and research and the creation of these videos. So I'm off to have a cold shower because I feel like a sweaty pig, but I will see you in the next video. Bye!